Welcome to Professor Wright. You have a voice. Let's find it. And welcome back to Professor Wright. I am the professor, D.A. Adams. Glad to have you back here for video number 8. So far in the series, in the writing process, we have covered pre-writing. We've covered the first 2 steps of pre-writing. We started with audience analysis, which should always be the first step of what you do. Then we moved into some idea gathering. For this video, we're going to look at organizing your thoughts and get started on taking these ideas that you've cobbled together and come up with, and we're going to start putting them into some kind of an order so you can sit down and start writing with them. Okay, so let's start with organizing your thoughts. Now, the first thing that we want to talk about is the difference between a formal and an informal outline. Now, if you've ever seen a formal outline before, this should look fairly familiar to you. You start, you have at the top of it, you have your thesis statement, which is the central idea of your paper. When I get to the video on parts of an essay, we'll get into a lot of detail about that. We're going to cover a whole video just on thesis statements. But the thesis statement goes at the top of the formal outline, and then it's broken down by Roman numerals. You'll have a main point, and then if you have one point, you have to have a second point, and then you can have subpoints underneath that, broken down into A's and B's, but if you have an A, you have to have a B. You can have a C without having a D, but if you have one, you definitely have to have 2. That's a formal outline. That is not what we're talking about here. But notice I'm not using the crap detector. I'm just marking this out because I don't want you thinking about it right now. This is not what we're doing yet, but formal outlines are important because you will use them in some papers that you do. So don't just completely discount this and don't just throw this away. If you're a student, there will come a time when you have to do some kind of a formal outline for a paper, and we will cover that later. What we're talking about here is the informal outline. The best way for me to show you the informal outline is to give you an idea of how we put one together. With the informal outline, let's start with our clustering. We've got these ideas that we've come up with, but right now they're just a bunch of ideas scribbled down as notes. We need to take it and start organizing it. So we look through, and let's say that these 2 subpoints that we came up with for idea 1, we can really use those. They're important, and we want to keep them. These 2, not so much. They're not useful. They don't really do what we want to do for this particular paper. They were good to come up with, but we don't need to keep them. So we're going to focus just on these 2 instead. Over here on idea number 3, we don't really need these 2 points that we came up with. We can just focus on this one subpoint and make one good strong paragraph out of this. So looking at this, we need to start organizing what order we want to cover these points when we get into our actual writing. Looking at it, I really think I'm going to go with idea number 2 here because to me it looks like the strongest one. Now obviously this is a generic example and there's no detail to it whatsoever. I'm just giving you a broad view of how you go about doing this. Then I'm probably going to go with idea number 1 as my second point, and then I'll use idea number 3 over here as my third point. From there, I need to translate it over into the informal outline. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that first point and we're going to transcribe it over from our clustering into the informal outline, along with its subpoints and any detail that we have going with it. We're going to jot that down and have it in front of us to look at. Now, I'm not going to do the same copy and paste here on the point coming from the clustering. I think you're probably smart enough to get it. You do the same thing. You take that point that you have that you're going to use as your second point, you transcribe it over from the clustering to the informal outline, and the same thing with number 3. Notice I don't have any subpoints listed under 3 there because I only have that one thing. That's all I'm going to focus on is that one point that I'm going to make there. Now that was a very simplified generic example, of course. So let's get a little more specific and let's look a little more closely at how we do this as far as getting into some detail. Let's take our double entry notes that we did, and we're going to start. Now obviously we'd already made a few marks on these, but we're going to take and start transcribing this over into an informal outline. And as we start, I look at this and I really want to take point number 1 here. I want to focus on exercise because I think that's the point I want to lead in with. The importance of getting exercise as a benefit of doing any kind of outdoor activity, any kind of yard work or landscaping or anything along those lines. From there, I'm going to then take this point that we've combined into one. I'm going to focus on the sunshine/weather. That's going to be my second point that I do. My third point, I'm going to go with the end product. I think that's really powerful, and I want to have it in there as well. And then I'm going to close with what I think is my strongest point, because sometimes you want to end on whatever you think is your strongest point that you're going to make. I'm going to close with point number 4 on tools, because to me that is the most important point that I'm going to make in this whole paper, so that's where I want to end. Now I've got these points, and really if I were doing this for real, you would see I would have a lot more marks on here. I would have notes drawn everywhere. I would have arrows pointing at this and that. I would have all kinds of stuff jotted down. It would look a lot different from what I'm showing you here, because the real work of writing ends up, the pre-writing part of it ends up being really sloppy for somebody like me. Now some people do it in a little neater fashion, but for most of us, especially those of us who are creative minded, our pre-writing is almost illegible for anybody except ourselves. So just know that if your pre-writing ends up looking like it's got scribbles all over it and it looks like it's a big mess, that's all right. A lot of us do it that way, and there's nothing wrong with that. So don't think that there is. Now, when I transcribe this over to the informal outline, first I'm going to start with that first point, exercise. And of course, with it I'm going to bring over any other points that I have, any other detail that I've got to go with it, all those little sub-points that I'm going to make there. Those need to be jotted down on the informal outline. I don't really have room to do it here on the screen, but just know that you should have it on there when you jot it down on your informal outline. Then I'm going to move to point 2, the sunshine and the weather. And then we're going to go to the end product. And then of course we're going to close with tools. And this is going to lay out the points that we have. But notice what I've got here now. As I start to write my paper, and as I get through each individual point, I've got a checklist. I can go through and mark off these points one by one as I go through them, and when I get done, I know I've covered all the points that I wanted to cover. And that's one of the great things that an informal outline does for you, is it allows you to make certain that you cover everything that you wanted to cover. I didn't write this down on the slide itself, and I didn't show you in the example here, but a lot of times what you'll find when you get into writing is that you really have way more stuff than you actually need if you've done really good pre-writing. If you've done good idea gathering and then put together a good informal outline, a lot of times you have a lot more information than you actually need for the finished product that you're going to put out. And so I may go through and I may mark off point 3, and I may only do half of point 1 because I'm just overwhelming my audience with information, and I don't need to do that. So just know that if you ever find yourself in that situation where you've got this great, wonderful informal outline, but it's way too much stuff, you can get rid of some of it. But always keep your strongest stuff. Don't throw away the good stuff. Throw away the stuff that you think is the weakest. That ends up being a judgment call on your part. You're the one who has to decide what stays in and what goes out. All right, so now that brings us to the end of pre-writing. We've covered audience analysis, idea gathering, and organizing. And we're going to get into, as we move forward, when I cover the sections on parts of an essay for students, and when we get into creative writing, I'm going to get into a few more techniques that are specific to those particular items. And I'm going to try to lay out for you, there's different ways that you go about organizing if you're doing a novel or if you're doing a short story. There's different ways that people do it. And I will try to give you those when we get to those points. But for now, that gives you a general idea of how to take your notes and start cobbling them into the beginnings of an essay or the beginnings of a story that you're going to tell, depending on how you're doing it. Now that gives you a general overview of how to start organizing your thoughts. So for those of you who are following the series along, that brings us to fish cabinet number 4 in 2 well-developed paragraphs. Please explain which idea gathering exercise works best for you, and what about it helps you develop your initial thoughts. Now remember, pick the ones that work for you. The ones that don't, throw them out. You do not need them. Don't focus on them. They're not worth your time and energy if they don't help you. Remember, the whole point of pre-writing is to give you a springboard to get into writing. If it doesn't do that, it doesn't matter. For fish cabinet number 4, just explain which form of idea gathering works best for you. If there's more than one, if you like both clustering and brainstorming, tell me that. Write that down. So that brings us to the end of video number 8 and wraps up pre-writing. So please join us next time for video number 9. We're going to get into writing, and we're going to talk about a couple of major things that you need to pay attention to when you sit down and start writing. All right, so thank you for joining us. I am the Professor D.A. Adams, and I'll see you next time.